Boys and girls, I greet you and welcome to this another segment of our lesson. But before I take you to our next lesson that I'm supposed to present this morning, I will need to go through correction for lesson number 23 that was handled by Mr. Mubala. It was basically on the effects of colonial rule in in Africa. He has told you that when we talk of effects, we are referring to results, we are referring to the end results. Those are synonyms that can mean effect, or another word for effect. So we also have the consequences, among others. So you were given an activity that I believe you did it well. There were 4 numbers, and number 1 was saying, name any 2 foreign languages introduced by colonialists in Africa. The truth is that these people came from different countries in Europe, and because of the nature of their countries of origin, they introduced their languages that they spoke in those countries to the countries that they took control of. So among those languages we have English, and that is one language that we speak in East Africa because we were ruled by the British, who speak English. We also have French, we have another one, German, we have Portuguese, we have Spanish, among other languages. So the next question was saying, mention 2 economic reasons for the coming of colonialists to Africa. We know that under their, the reasons of colonial rule in East Africa, in Africa, basically we grouped them under economic, social, and political. Now, in this particular question, you are asked to give the economic reasons, which include introduction of new crops, they built processing industries, they constructed roads to ease transport, they improved the communication network that widened market for goods, they introduced legitimate trade, and which legitimate trade replaced the illegitimate trade that involved the sale of human beings purposely for their labor that you learned as being slave trade. We move yet to another question, and that was question number 3, which says, write 2 ways colonial rule affected Africans negatively. So we see that high taxation was introduced. There was forced labor with little or no pay. The Africans were forced to work in their plantations with either little or no pay. Africa's resources were exploited for the benefits of the colonialists. There was loss of fertile land by the Africans. We'll get to see that in our next lesson, where we get a case study of Kenya, where the Kenyans lost the fertile Kenya island to the white settlers. Africans lost political independence. Before the coming of these people, Africans were politically independent. They were governing themselves and managing their resources. But when these people came, they took control of that. Boys and girls, our question number 4 was saying, in which one way did colonialists use money collected from Africans? We are looking at the taxes that they impose on the Africans. How did this benefit them? What did they use this money for? One was to meet colonial administrative cost. In any administration, there is cost that must be met. Things that need money to buy or to put them in place needed money. So these people use this money to meet their administrative costs. They also use this very money to pay colonial workers, both foreigners and then Africans who are employed by these people were paid. And then the next one was to provide social services. And when we talk of social services, we are looking at services like education, we are looking at services like health services, transport, among others. So boys and girls, that brings us to the end of our correction, and we get now to our next lesson, that is lesson 24, that I'm welcoming you to. So you are highly welcome from the comfort of your living rooms. Let us now get to lesson 24. And our lesson 24, we are basically going to look at settlers in Africa. And when we talk of settlers in Africa, here we are not looking at the indigenous Africans who are living in Africa, but we are looking at those people who came from other continents and then established a permanent stay in Africa. Here, when we are looking at settlers in Africa, we have two categories of people that we are supposed to look at. We have the Asians, wherein under Asians we have the Arabs and then the Indians. They came and then established their settlement in Africa. And these were the very first group of people that came to settle in Africa. And then another group of people that came were Europeans. Europeans came from Europe, and that is why we are calling them Europeans. Also, these people came and settled in Africa. And basically, our aim right now, you looked at the Arabs and Indians when we were looking at slave trade. We know for sure that the perpetrators of slave trade in Africa were basically Arabs. But at this particular point, our emphasis is going to be on European settlers in Africa. European settlers in Africa. We are saying European settlers were people who came to set up their homes in Africa. Now, the fact that they came to set up their homes in Africa meant that they were not ready to return to Europe, but to settle in Africa permanently. They were mainly called white settlers. Why are we calling them white settlers? Because the occupants or the inhabitants of Europe were purely whites. It is today that we see that we have also a couple of black people in Europe, but this became descendants of the slave traders. So when the slaves were taken there, and after the abolition of slave trade, they chose to stay there, and now we have their descendants staying there, and that's why we see that we also have the blacks in those countries, in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Now, the first group of white settlers or European settlers to come to Africa were Portuguese settlers. So these ones came from Portugal. We also have them in East Africa. We have them, the Portuguese, when they came to East Africa, they lived in Kenya and then Tanzania. So these Portuguese, we are also talking about them as being the group of settlers. So they were the very first group of settlers, European settlers that came to East Africa, to Africa. They mainly settled in Angola and Mozambique. That is where the Portuguese established their base in Africa, Angola and then and Mozambique. Unfortunately, you realize that Angola and Portuguese were not settled upon by other settlers or white settlers that came. Reason being that Angola and Mozambique were not suitable for large-scale white settlements. So that is why only the Portuguese occupied these countries. So why do you think Angola and Mozambique were not suitable for large-scale white settlers? We give these two reasons. One, it was due to presence of tropical diseases, and then due to harsh tropical climate. So this tells you that yes, Angola and Mozambique lie within the tropical climate or within the tropics. So that alone gave the areas to be very hot, not to be suitable for the settlement of the colonialists. We continue with our lesson, boys and girls. We are looking at examples of African countries permanently occupied by the whites. examples of African countries permanently occupied by the whites. So here we are looking at countries like Kenya, and we will dwell so much when we are talking about, looking at Kenya, because we are in East Africa and Kenya is found in East Africa. We are going to talk more about it, and we have also another one, Angola. In the central part of Africa, we have South Africa, we have Mozambique, and then we have Zimbabwe. Not forgetting Namibia there. These were countries that the colonialists established their settlement and they settled there. Now, European settlers, we are now getting to Kenya. And we are looking at Kenya as a place where this Europeans settle. Now, they came after the construction of the Uganda Railway. Now, boys and girls, in primary 6, we learned about the construction of the Uganda Railway. And we now know why it is called the Uganda Railway. This railway does not only run through Uganda, but it runs through Kenya to Uganda. It is the railway line that opened the interior of Uganda and connected or linked it to the coast of Mombasa. So the construction of the Uganda Railway became one of the leading cause or reason for the coming of the settlers to Kenya. They mainly settled in Kenya Island, that is central part of Kenya, when they got to Kenya. And this group of people were led by this very man. Now, this man was not alone, but we are taking him. Why are we taking him? Because he was the one who encouraged other whites to come and settle on the Kenya Island. This man was called Lord Baron Delame. Now, Lord Baron Delame, here we see his photo. This was a man who encouraged other whites to settle on the Kenya Island. Now, Lord Baron, he had the reason. He was the leader of the white settlers in Kenya. Now, why did the white settlers why did they choose to settle in Kenya Island? So our next subheading is saying why the white settlers chose to settle in Kenya Highland. Reasons being, one, there was presence of fertile soil. Fertile soil is what attracts farmers to settle in an area, because when the soil is fertile, there is assured production of food. So these people chose to settle in the Kenya Highlands because of the presence of fertile soil. Two, the climate was cool. It was comparable to that one of their home country, because these people came from cool climate area, so they decided to settle in Kenya Island because of the cool climate. And the next reason that attracted them to settle in Kenya Island was the absence of populations over large areas. So the population there was dotted with basically the herdsmen. So that gave them the chance to occupy the place. We move on and to see how this man, Lord Baron Delame, was helpful to the white settlers in Kenya. We see that one, he introduced the dairy farming in Kenya. So dairy farming in Kenya is basically concentrated in the Kenya Highland, which many of them which was occupied by most of the white settlers. Two, Lord Baron Delame encouraged the white settlers to cultivate the land. Why did he encourage them to cultivate the land? The land was fertile enough for the cultivation of crops, and when they cultivated, they definitely yielded high yield of crops that supported the Kenyan economy. He was the leader of the white settlers in Kenya. I repeat, learners, that this man was the leader of white settlers in Kenya. In primary 6, we learned that this man was even the representative of the whites, and he supported or tabled the ideas or the interests of the whites in the legislative council. So he was the leader of the white settlers in Kenya. So we continue while looking at why Lord Baron Delame introduced dairy farming in Kenya. At this point, you can even answer now this or tackle this very particular subject here, because I have told you that why these people chose to settle there, it is because of the presence of cool climate. So Lord Delame introduced dairy farming in Kenya because of the presence of cool climate, basically not in the entire Kenya, but central Kenya, that is Kenya Island. Another one was presence of enough water and pasture for dairy cattle. There is no way you can carry out dairy farming when you don't have enough water and when you don't have the presence of pasture, because you're supposed to feed these animals and also water them. Another reason is that Kenya Highland is up to now flies free infected area. Now, because Kenya Island was free of flies, it encouraged the rearing of dairy cattle. It is not like central Tanzania, where we have Miombo woodland being infested with the flies. So boys and girls, you can excuse me, you are not ladies, you are boys and girls. So we are also looking at another reason why this man introduced dairy farming in Kenya, as being the presence of improved veterinary services. Animals, just like human beings, also need to be treated when they fall sick. So in the absence of veterinary services, it becomes hard for you to do that activity. We continue to looking at how the coming of white settlers affected the Kikuyu community. Now, the Kikuyu were the occupants of the Kenya Highlands. So the coming of these people affected this Kikuyu community greatly, in that they were displaced from their homeland or their original area of settlement. Two, the white settlers grabbed the Kikuyu land. Now, the Kikuyu land, which was fertile, that is the Kenya Island, was grabbed from them. So that was a negative effect onto the the Kikuyu, who were the Kenyans. Even up to now, they're still Kenyans. The Kikuyu were not allowed to grow cash crops. This was really a disservice. So these people were negatively affected. The Kikuyu were also overtaxed. Next, the whites introduced forced labor. So the Kikuyu became squatters on their land, and then they had to work for the whites. Whether willingly or not, these people were made to work in the white lands, plantation. The whites introduced Chipande system. This is a system of identity. Without identification, you will not be allowed to move within your territory. So you would only move with the help of this. Now, why were Kenyans not allowed to grow cash crops? We now look at why Kenyans were not allowed by the colonialists or these settlers to grow cash crops. Reasons being the whites feared, or the white settlers feared competition for market. They knew when the Kenyans were allowed to grow their own cash crop, they would compete them in the market. So they feared the competition. So you get to know that a white man is naturally a coward. Two, the white settlers wanted to control African resources. So they knew that if the Africans were allowed to grow their own cash crop, they were going to be powerful and they would resist them. They would become rebellious. Now, to suppress them, then they were restrained. They were not allowed to grow their own cash crop. The white settlers wanted to use Africans for cheap labor. So it was their fear. They knew that if these people were allowed to grow their own cash crop, they would not accept, however much they forced them, they would force them to work on their plantation, these people would not accept. So because they needed cheap labor from Africans, they had to deny them access of growing their own cash crops. So boys and girls, with all this, we now come to the end of our lesson. But I want to tell you that you are so much needed in this in this nation, and because of that I encourage you to stay safe and remain good children. Be helpful to your parents this time. We need you to stay safe, and even the time for you to come back to school, we would want to see you all here alive and kicking. May God bless you. Stay safe, and remember, this pandemic is still combing the world. We need you and we need you alive. God bless you.